All right, from inflation to a rebooted carbon tax to this crisis in the Pacific, there's a lot to go through with my next guest. Greg Sheridan, a foreign editor of The Australian, joins me now from Melbourne. Greg, I look to you on Thursday to give us some hope, some reality. And, you know, you cross into a lot of portfolio areas, but some hope in our country, because I think a lot of Australians are feeling a bit flat at the moment, and we will choose a government come the 21st of May for what will be, I think, a very rocky period ahead. We saw inflation double 5.1, an increase, a two-decade increase yesterday. We're talking about a rate rise as early as next week. How do you think this is going to play out?
Well, Peter, I wouldn't want to give you any false good cheer. I think the rate rise will be marginally damaging to the government, but only very marginally. Interest rates are still extremely low. A lot of Australians are a long way ahead in their mortgage. It's not as if they're going to be feeling interest rate pain before they go to the ballot box. I think that's going to be very, very marginal. I do think it's a very bad campaign. I think both parties just talk rubbish on the climate, really. I think, you know, Matt Canavan is the skunk at the party because he's the only person telling the truth about climate change, that the net zero target is kind of already gone when you look at all the actions of the Europeans and the Americans, not to mention the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians. But to say that is very bad form. So we're having a kind of a postmodern election campaign where reality is very bad manners to bring in too much reality, and you've just got to stick with the symbols and the slogans.
Well, let me just pick up that, because you were absolutely right. We're talking about a $1.5 billion hit to 200 odd of our largest businesses, our coal mines, which have boosted the budget in recent months and years, obviously heavy industry, which we absolutely need in a security crisis or a period where we're heading for a security crisis. You point to Europe, where they're recanting all of this because they've actually got a real existential threat on their doorstep in Ukraine. How are we having this two-track global conversation in Australia? We're still stuck back at Glasgow Climate Summit, and the rest of the world is in a very different place.
You're absolutely right, Peter. I mean, I started writing about climate change only because as foreign editor I was travelling around Asia, and what was happening there just bore no relation to what the Rudd and Gillard governments were saying way back then. Now, Labor's policy, I think, would actually be very damaging to Australian industry, would impose massive costs on it, lead to much more expensive energy. But the only thing you can say in favour of it is that they never implement their policy when they're in office. I mean, every government utters these climate cliches before the election and then gets mugged by reality. And you've always got this awkward, unhappy period of adjustment after the campaign.
Except Julia Gillard.
And of course, if you impose... well, but then the story of her prime ministership was a story of its collapse because of her climate policies. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if you try to implement these crazy policies, reality just doesn't... I mean, this postmodern discourse that we're having simply doesn't square with reality, and reality is very intractable. It just doesn't take account of your ideological proclivities. It's like the German crisis with gas now. They're going to have to get out of Russian gas, which means they're going to have a big fossil fuel industry all of their own, plus they're going to import fossil fuel from the United States and probably from us. But whatever's happening, it's not being solved by wind farms and solar energy.
Another fight this week, though, that didn't add up was the issue in the Solomon Islands. Now, I completely agree with commentary to say Maurice Payne should have been more proactive, perhaps been there earlier. But this is a sovereign country. It would be great if they hadn't have done the deal with the Chinese, but we can't stop it. We can try and influence it. And then Labor's out there saying it's actually all about climate change. Well, if it was about climate change, you wouldn't do a deal with the Chinese.
No, well, that's absolutely right. So I think Labor claiming it's about climate change is absolute nonsense. It's just ridiculous. China is the biggest emitting country in the world, and it's increasing its emissions, you know, at a rapid rate of knots while we're cutting ours. However, I don't want to give the government a free pass here because It's not the government's fault that this happened. It's absolutely not the government's fault. It's Sogavare's fault plus the Chinese Communist Party. But as recently as last November, we sent Australian soldiers and Australian police forces to save Sogavare's prime ministership. You know, they went into the streets and stopped the rioters and so on, who were incensed with Sogavare's pro-China outlook. Now, we've spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on the Solomons over the last 15 years. We've deployed troops and soldiers left, right and centre. Our intelligence agencies surely knew all about this stuff long in advance. They read every significant email and listen to every significant conversation that a Pacific leader conducts. Now, if out of all that, and the government constantly preens itself on how fantastically influential it is in the South Pacific. Now, if after all that, you cannot stop what is an agreement, in fact, to have a Chinese military facility there, although hopefully it won't come about, then I think that is a real mark of failure of Australian statecraft and policy.
The issue, though, in part, isn't it, Greg, that our public money has gone to the Solomons to protect life and liberty. It's been aid programs that pass the probity test, and money from China, the allegation is, goes directly into the pockets of politicians they've bought off.
That's absolutely true, Peter, and that's a significant disadvantage that we labour under. But, you know, all through the Cold War, that was the same disadvantage we laboured under when combating the Soviet Union for influence. And democracies that are smart can overcome that. You know, you find remarkably that leaders' sons and daughters get wonderful scholarships to Western universities. You find all kinds of clever things happen which you know, mediate influence and so forth. You find that you've had a very active dialogue with the opposition, the local opposition. You find that you've encouraged all your friends and partners to be there. So there's been no US embassy. You would have liked a US embassy there talking about all these matters. Now, I think the US is frankly very disillusioned with the quality of our leadership in the Pacific, and they're coming back to the South Pacific in a big way. That's good. I think probably it was a come to Jesus moment when Kurt Campbell and Matt Crittenbreck and the deputy commander of PACOM and so on went and saw Sogavare in Honiara and told him they would respond in kind if the Chinese ever opened a base there. I think that's got to be much more consequential than our Prime Minister telling the Chinese they'll cross a red line if they open a base there. I mean, again, I come back to the postmodern quality of this Australian election campaign. What are we going to do if China crosses a red line that we disagree with? This is sort of, I mean, this is fantasy land. It's just, and the only area of the whole world where the world looks to us to have responsibility for the geostrategic outcome is the South Pacific. And here it is. True, the Chinese can pay bribes and we can't, but that's not a blanket excuse for diplomatic failure.
Firm but fair, Greg Sheridan, as always. Appreciate your time. See you next week.